The smell of meat was the first thing that broke her. Not orders, not gunfire, not even the rattling trucks that had dragged them across half a continent, but the smell, fat-rich, seared, thick in the late Texas dusk. It rose like incense over the field, curling above tin roofs and horses grazing under barbed wire fences. In the open-air kitchen, a cowboy flipped another steak on a grill blackened by years of branding fire and rain, and beside him stood a girl from Nagasaki, barely 18, holding a pair of tongs like they were surgical instruments. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from hunger, from memory. A month ago, she'd lived in a hospital tent ringed by bomb craters. Now she was turning steaks for the same country she'd been trained to despise. That night, every cowboy on the ranch was fed by Japanese hands. The prisoners cooked the dinner. The guards sat down and ate. Together, no speeches, no orders, just meat, heat, and a silence thick with things no one dared say aloud. The fire pit at the center of the camp had always seemed off-limits. It was where the cowboys gathered in the evenings, boots up on benches, tin mugs in hand, the scent of tobacco curling upward like smoke signals from a distant, easier world. The Japanese prisoners had watched from the edges, unmoving, silent, wrapped in wool blankets and doubt, until this afternoon. Until the guard with the sun-faded neckerchief and the crooked smile walked over and said, not barked, "You girls ever cook steaks?" The question floated in the air like a challenge, like a joke no one knew how to laugh at. None of the women answered. They just stared at him, unsure if this was the beginning of a trap or a test. Cooking was familiar, but cooking for them? Yuriko was the first to move. She had once prepared food for wounded pilots in a freezing base kitchen back in Hokkaido, boiled rice, fish bones, dried seaweed. Her hands had known grease, but not from meat like this. Not American beef, not something that sizzled and bled. She reached for the apron, her fingers slow, her heart slamming against her ribs like a warning bell. When she tied the string behind her back, she expected someone to grab her arm, snatch it away. No one did. One by one, the other girls followed, silent, stunned. The cowboys cleared the pit, spread crates into makeshift counters, and brought out trays stacked with marbled steaks, thick and red and pulsing with cold. One cowboy offered a knife, hilt first. The blade gleamed. Not a weapon, a tool. Yuriko took it, her breath hitching. It was heavier than she expected. She glanced around, half expecting an officer to slap it from her hand. But there were no officers here, no shouted slogans, only smoke, firewood, and men watching without menace. As the first steak hit the grill, the sound was immediate. A sharp hiss, almost a cry. The fat curled up in the flames, spitting and popping. The smoke coiled around their heads, thick with a smell that reached straight into their bones. It was unbearable and irresistible. Teruko, who hadn't spoken in 3 days, whispered, "Smells like when father sold fish in the market." Then she bit her lip and fell silent. The memory had escaped before she could stop it. Their hands moved with automatic rhythm. Salt, turn, wait, flip. The tongs clicked like clockwork. Sizzle. Another slab of meat, then another. One cowboy stepped close to the fire, nodded approvingly, and pointed to the edge of the grill. "Hotter here," he said. Yuriko blinked. Not a command, a tip. She adjusted the steak, and he smiled, like they were comrades, not captors and captives. She looked away quickly, ashamed that the warmth in her chest had nothing to do with the fire. By the third batch, the women had fallen into a strange, focused silence. Their bodies moved, but their minds reeled. None of it made sense. They had arrived at this place expecting humiliation, perhaps even torment. Instead, they were being asked to feed the enemy. And the enemy, these boots, hats, tobacco men, waited patiently, joked with each other, shared coffee from battered thermoses. One even offered Teruko a sip. She refused, eyes wide, but the gesture remained suspended in her memory like a photograph. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky into a watercolor of gold and bruised purple, the air thickened with meat and smoke. More cowboys gathered near the edge of the pit, watching, not taunting, not staring, just watching. The prisoners kept cooking. The fire roared and the smell lingered in their clothes, their hair, their skin. It was everywhere, inescapable. And for the first time since stepping off the trucks, they were not waiting to be punished. They were waiting for the next stake to turn. Yuriko's hands no longer trembled. Not because the fear was gone, but because something older had taken its place. Muscle memory. The kind that remembers heat, knives, seasoning. The kind passed down from mothers who once cooked fish in battered pans over charcoal stoves in shuttered homes. She had forgotten that part of herself. The war had starved it out. And now, here in Texas, under enemy flags and American sky, she remembered. She pressed her palm against the stake, felt it push back with heat and firmness. It was ready. She lifted it, let the juices drip, and placed it gently on a waiting plate. Then another, then another. Behind her, someone whispered, "They're letting us cook the steaks." No one replied. The truth didn't need to be said out loud. It was already in the air, in the fire, in the smell, in the silence that held everything together like the iron of the grill. Before she ever saw a steak or held tongs over a fire built by cowboys, Natsuko was told that the Americans would skin her alive, that they would strip her naked, laugh while doing it, and then hand her body over to dogs. She was 15 when the pamphlets started appearing. Thin booklets passed around in hushed corridors, marked top secret, not for civilian eyes. The images were crude, violent, always the same. An American soldier with a knife, a Japanese girl on her knees. Shame was the weapon, and it cut deeper than steel. "They are not human," one instructor had said flatly. "You must never let them take you alive." Every girl in the room nodded. To surrender was to die twice, once in body, once in honor. Natsuko had never questioned this. In her corner of Osaka, the sky was made of smoke. She slept under boards, nailed across shattered windows. Food came in scraps, soybean paste, thinned with rainwater, rice dust mixed with weeds. Her older brother had vanished into the army. Her mother, face carved by worry, whispered prayers into empty bowls. When Natsuko was conscripted as a hospital assistant, there were no goodbyes, only instructions. "Do your duty. Don't come home dishonored." She scrubbed floors, slick with blood, folded bandages stiff with dried marrow, and held the hands of boys who died too quickly to scream. The nurses said little. Their mouths were lines, their eyes older than time. The radio in the hall played nothing but updates from the Emperor's court, until one day it didn't. Word spread like ink in water. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The shame arrived faster than the silence. 2 days later, American trucks rolled through the ruined streets. Natsuko was pushed onto a flatbed with other girls, all of them barefoot, all of them watching their city disappear through soot-stained lashes. They expected chains. They expected whips. What they got instead was a boat. It didn't look like a prison ship. There were real bunks, blankets, soup. A man, blond, wide-shouldered, sunburned, handed her a metal bowl filled with something brown and salty. She stared at it for a full minute, unmoving. It smelled like broth, Her stomach twisted. Poison, she thought, but she was too tired to fight. She brought it to her lips. It burned. She drank anyway. When she woke the next morning, she was still alive. That was the first betrayal of what she'd been taught. Days blurred into ocean and steel. She learned to keep her head down, to nod when spoken to pretend she understood English. She didn't speak to the guards, but she watched them. They smoked in silence, wrote letters, sometimes laughed at things she couldn't hear. One dropped a pencil and picked it up in front of her without flinching. He didn't leer. He didn't shout. He just nodded. That's the trap, she thought. Make us feel safe. Then they'll strike. But no strike came. When the ship docked in San Francisco, Natsuko stepped off, expecting cold pavement and barking dogs. Instead, the wind smelled like salt and sweet bread. A nurse handed her a bar of soap. It was white, heavy. It smelled like flowers. She clutched it as though it might disappear. A shower waited inside the intake building. Hot water, real towels. She cried under the spray and didn't know why. No one mocked her. No one watched. At the train yard, soldiers herded them onto rail cars, but not like cattle. There were windows, vents, seats with cushions. Natsuko sat in silence, clutching her soap like a child with a talisman. Someone across from her mouthed the words, "Are we in heaven or hell?" No one answered. By the time the train reached the Texas ranch, her shoes were gone, but her body had gained weight. Small amounts, enough to fill out her collarbones. When the gate opened and she saw horses, barns, and cowboys with rifles slung over their backs like tools, something in her cracked. They said we were animals, she thought, but the only ones who'd fed her were wearing enemy uniforms. That night, she slept under a wool blanket that didn't smell of mildew, didn't itch, and wasn't taken from someone dying. She stared at the ceiling for hours, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she didn't know how to feel human anymore. The next morning, someone handed her a knife. Not a soldier's bayonet or the rusted blades she'd seen strapped to thighs in the Osaka infirmary. This was a kitchen knife, broad, gleaming, balanced, a butcher's tool. Natsuko held it by the handle like it might bite. The edge caught the morning light and flashed silver against the wood of the makeshift table. She turned it slightly, saw her face staring back in the curve of the blade. Hollow cheeks, chapped lips, hair tied back in string. A ghost, but still alive. Around her, the others were silent, unsure. They stood behind counters that had been set up under the shadow of the barn, where the fire pit from the night before still smoldered. Slabs of raw beef, dense and marbled, waited beside bowls of chopped garlic, coarse salt, potatoes, and onions. The cowboys had hauled in wooden crates for seating, tin basins for mixing, and an entire sack of flour. One guard pointed toward the onions and mimed chopping. No words, no barked orders, just the gesture. Someone exhaled. Yuriko, the quiet one from Nagasaki, stepped forward and picked up a paring knife. She squared her shoulders, gripped the onion like a grenade, and started slicing. The blade thumped softly on the cutting board. Steady, precise. Her mouth tightened as the scent stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. Another girl followed, then another. Soon the space filled with the rhythmic sound of knives, metal on wood, skin on fire. Natsuko was given a hunk of beef. A cowboy pointed at a diagram drawn in charcoal on a scrap of paper. Cut here, against the grain. She nodded, pretending to understand. Then she looked down at the meat, thick, red, cold. She had never touched so much protein in her life. Her hands shook as she pressed the blade into flesh. It resisted, then gave. She cut again, and again. Each slice brought something unexpected, relief. Not because the work was easy, but because the work was hers. There were no overseers shouting behind them, only cowboys leaning against fence posts, watching without menace. One of them, young, freckled, chewing a toothpick, gestured toward a pan that had begun to smoke. "Too hot," he said, and turned the handle away from the fire. Natsuko blinked. He didn't grab her hand, didn't shove, just helped, then stepped back again. It was maddening, this quietness, this space they were being given. She kept expecting it to collapse. When Teruko spilled a bowl of diced onions, she flinched back like a dog expecting to be struck. But nothing happened. The bowl rolled to a stop. A cowboy picked it up, brushed the dirt from the rim, and handed it back. "It's all right," he said in clumsy Japanese. "Happens." Teruko stared at him for a moment. Then, impossibly, she smiled. The moment cracked open the air. Someone laughed, a real laugh, short, startled, half hysterical. Then another joined in. It was awkward and sharp and full of disbelief, but it was laughter just the same. The kind that didn't ask permission, the kind that felt like rebellion. One girl pointed to her apron, too big for her frame, and made a joke about being mistaken for a rancher's wife. Another mimicked the way a cowboy walked, slow and wide, like he was always stepping over cattle. The imitation was terrible, but it worked. A ripple of laughter spread through the group like a sudden storm breaking after drought. Even Natsuko smiled, though she caught herself and looked away quickly. Her hands kept cutting. The meat curled under her fingers, marbled and strange, but hers to command. The knife was no longer something to fear. It was a tool. It responded to her will. It obeyed. She had not been given power in years. Not like this. Not control over something real. The kitchen smelled of garlic and smoke now. The sun had risen higher, casting long beams through the gaps in the barn walls. Dust swirled in golden arcs. Somewhere in the distance, a horse snorted. A harmonica played a slow, meandering tune, lazy, almost sweet. No one said anything about it. They just kept working. The girls cooked like they were building something, not just a meal, not just flavor, but memory, reclamation. Every slice of meat was a refusal to disappear. Every peeled potato, a quiet, defiant act of presence. They were still prisoners, yes, still behind fences, but today they had knives, and the knives were not weapons. They were freedom. The oil hit the skillet with a hiss that sounded like something alive. It bubbled up around the edge of the steak, spitting flecks of fat onto the stove's rim. Yuriko flinched, not from fear, but from memory. The scent rose instantly, thick and dizzying. Salt, beef, burnt edges, garlic riding on the back of smoke. It was intoxicating and dangerous. The last time she had smelled oil cooking, she had been crouched behind her mother in a shack on the outskirts of Nagasaki. Her mother had managed to barter a spoonful of sesame oil for 2 buttons and a pair of old shoes. She'd poured it into the pan like it was holy water, letting it coat a handful of wilted greens pulled from the edge of a bombed-out field. Yuriko remembered every sound, the pop, the sizzle, the way the oil clung to the leaves like silk. That meal lasted less than 5 minutes. Her little sister cried when it was gone. Now, here she was, wrist-deep in American abundance, her hands moving through it like a dream she didn't trust. As the fat thickened and the meat browned, a wave of nausea caught her off guard. Not because the food was bad, but because it wasn't. She gagged softly behind her hand and stepped away from the stove. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. Behind her, Natsuko turned a strip of steak with the confidence of someone who no longer feared the fire. Her face was flushed, hair sticking to her forehead. She looked normal, almost proud. Yuriko's stomach turned again. Not from hunger this time, but from something far heavier. My family is starving, she thought. My mother is boiling weeds, and I am cooking for the enemy. She clenched the towel in her fist. Her knees felt weak. A strange heat pressed behind her eyes, and for a second she thought she might faint. She backed away slowly, past the edge of the open-air kitchen, past the crates and the smoke and the laughing guards. She ducked behind the barn and leaned against the wood, heart thudding like a drum. No one followed. She was grateful for that. The guilt was thick, and it was growing. For weeks she had dreamed only of food, of hot broth, of fried rice, of her mother's hands rubbing salt into sardines. Now the dream was real, and it hurt. To be fed while your family starved was one kind of cruelty, but to feed the enemy while they starved, that was another. She sank to the dirt, pulled her knees to her chest, and pressed her forehead to her arms. The smell of the meat still clung to her skin. Her hands were greasy with it, her apron stained. She hated how much she had enjoyed it. The rhythm of chopping, the warmth of the fire, the nod of approval from the cowboy with the gray-streaked beard. She had even smiled, just once, and now it tasted like betrayal. Something rustled nearby. She looked up, startled. A plate had been left on the corner of a crate just behind the barn. A small piece of steak, a wedge of bread, a scoop of beans. It was probably leftovers, or maybe someone had brought it for her and left quietly. She didn't know. She didn't care. Her hand moved on its own. She reached out, picked up the bread first. It was still warm, soft at the center. She tore off a piece and chewed. It was sweet, yeasted, real. Then the steak. She took a bite so small it barely registered. But the flavor hit like lightning, rich, buttery, laced with black pepper and something that tasted like smoke and summer. Her throat tightened. She swallowed hard. And then the tears came. Not loud, not heaving, just silent streams that soaked her cheeks, dropped into the dirt, and vanished. She ate slowly, wiping her nose on her sleeve, breathing between bites like someone drowning between waves. It wasn't just food. It was everything she'd lost. Everything her country had taught her to refuse. It was memory and shame and hope, all stuffed inside one mouthful of meat. She finished the plate. Then she sat in the dirt a while longer, staring at her hands. They didn't feel like traitors. They felt like hands that wanted to feed someone else, someone she had left behind. She stood up quietly and walked back toward the fire. The smell no longer made her sick. But it didn't make her whole either. It just reminded her that she was still here, still human, still hungry, for more than food. The plates were full now. Steaks cooked medium, juice pooling at the edges, beans peppered with bacon fat, biscuits still steaming from the fire. The women had arranged them in rows on long wooden planks, turned into makeshift tables, unsure what came next. They didn't know if they were to serve the food or watch it be eaten. They didn't know if someone would test it for poison, or if the whole thing had been a farce. Some strange, slow punishment for losing the war. So they stood back, waiting, arms crossed, eyes down, braced. The cowboys came forward slowly, not in formation, not with arrogance, but like men finishing a long shift under the sun. Some still had work gloves tucked into their back pockets. One lit a cigarette, then stubbed it out with care before reaching for a plate. He offered a small nod to the girl closest to the table. She didn't meet his eyes. Another took a plate, then grinned, wide, gap-toothed, and muttered something in English that sounded like praise. The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, and it confused them. Where was the mockery, the laughter, the barked commands? The men sat down on benches and crates, plates balanced on their knees. They didn't devour the food like animals. They didn't throw scraps on the ground. They ate like people who were used to eating, calmly, slowly, respectfully. One of them chewed with his eyes closed, as if savoring something he hadn't tasted in weeks. Another patted his stomach and sighed with theatrical delight. The women kept waiting for the twist, for the table to flip, for someone to spit the food back onto the plate and accuse them of sabotage. But the accusations never came, only second helpings. Then it happened. A tall cowboy with a limp stood, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked directly at the line of Japanese girls. His face was weathered, beard patchy, sunburn peeling across his nose. He raised a tin cup in one hand, then said, in a thick Texan drawl that butchered every syllable, "Arigato." Silence. A dozen heads turned to look at him. He repeated it, louder this time. "Arigato." He bowed slightly at the waist, awkward but sincere. The word hung in the air like a dropped lantern. And then, like the crack of a shell, someone laughed. It was Teruko. Her laugh was high, surprised, almost horrified at itself. She slapped a hand over her mouth as if to catch it before it escaped again. But it was too late. Laughter spread like a ripple on a still pond. A few of the other women chuckled. One clutched her apron and whispered, "He tried." Another added, "It was better than the guard last week who called me a tomato." The ice had cracked. Not melted, cracked. Sharp edges still remained, but something had shifted. The cowboy smiled, clearly proud of himself. He pointed to the biscuits, gave a thumbs up, then tapped his chest and said, "Joe?" A name. He was giving them a name. Yuriko whispered, "We're not supposed to talk to them." Natsuko replied, almost too softly to hear, "But they talk to us." That was the danger, wasn't it? Not the food, not the work, but the kindness, because it threatened everything they'd been taught. If the enemy could say thank you, if the enemy could eat your food without suspicion, if the enemy could learn your words and bow to you across a camp table, then maybe the enemy wasn't the devil at all. And if he wasn't, then what had it all been for? They stood there, unmoving, while the sun bled into the dirt and the sky turned the color of memory. Plates emptied, smiles exchanged, and somewhere in the middle of Texas, behind a barbed wire fence, the strangest dinner in the world passed without a single insult, without a single blow. They ate without fear. And that was what terrified the women most. When the last cowboy scraped his plate clean and leaned back on his crate with a satisfied grunt, the air shifted again. The women, still lined up behind the tables, half expected to be dismissed, to be told to gather the scraps into buckets and return to their quarters. But no orders came. Instead, a sergeant with a clipboard gestured toward the food still warm on the grills and said gently, "You all eat now." They didn't move, so he pointed again, slower this time, and said, "Go on, sit, eat." For a moment, no one did. Then, as if pulled by something deeper than permission, Natsuko stepped forward, picked up a tin plate, and served herself half a piece of steak. She sat down on a bale of hay, legs trembling, eyes locked on her food. One by one the others followed. No one rushed. No one took too much. They ate quietly, almost reverently, heads bowed not in fear, but in awe. It wasn't the taste that stunned them. It was the dignity of it all. Plates, real ones, not tin buckets, not chipped bowls shared between 5. Each girl had her own. Forks and knives, too. Water was passed around in canteens. Someone had even placed napkins at the edge of the table. Cloth napkins, the kind you only saw in magazines or on the tables of rich Tokyo businessmen. And then came the bottle. It was glass, small, cold. The label was bright red and white. A cowboy handed it to Yuriko with a grin and a pat on the shoulder. "Coca-Cola," he said, like it was a gift from the gods. She stared at it. She'd never seen anything like it before. The bottle hissed softly when she twisted the cap. Bubbles raced to the top, fizzing with a sound that reminded her of summer rain against bamboo. She sniffed it. Sweet, spicy, alive. The others watched her like she was holding a bomb. Then she drank. The liquid hit her tongue like fire and syrup all at once. Her eyes widened. Her hand shook. And before she could stop herself, she started crying. Not loud, just tears running down her face as she clutched the bottle like it held her childhood. Because in a way, it did. This was the America she'd heard whispered about before the war, land of movie stars, jukeboxes, and vending machines. Land of too much, of abundance so bright it could blind. She looked around, half expecting someone to laugh. No one did. A guard near the fence lit a cigarette, looked away politely, gave her privacy to fall apart. The food was good, but it wasn't just food. It was kindness dressed in beef and cola, and it broke something open inside them. They weren't being punished. They weren't being mocked. They were being cared for. And that hurt more than any slap, because it raised questions no one had the strength to answer. Who am I, if the enemy feeds me like this? What was all the fear for, if this is how they treat prisoners? Yuriko took another sip and passed the bottle to Natsuko, who stared at it like it might whisper secrets. She drank slowly, lips barely touching the glass, and closed her eyes. The fizz tickled her nose. She smiled without meaning to. It wasn't just refreshment, it was contradiction in liquid form, a luxury she'd never known from the hands of a man she was taught to hate. They finished their meal in near silence, chewing slowly, licking salt from their fingers. No one took more than they needed. Every bite was measured, sacred. By the time they stood, the sky had turned lavender. The wind had cooled. Somewhere, a harmonica played again. This time the melody felt softer, less foreign. No one told them to return to their quarters, but they did, plates stacked, forks wiped clean, because for the first time in years they had been allowed to sit, to eat, and to feel, if only for a moment, like they were not prisoners, but guests. And that was harder to accept than any prison sentence. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. The women lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling beams or into the dark, each one turning over the same impossible thought in her mind. They let us cook. They ate it. No one was poisoned. No one screamed. And perhaps, stranger than all of that, they trusted us with knives. Yuriko pulled her thin blanket up to her chin, though the Texas heat made it unnecessary. She listened to the soft breathing around her, to the occasional creak of the boards. Somewhere, someone was writing. A faint scratch of pencil on paper. She turned her head slightly and saw Natsuko sitting cross-legged on her bunk, lit by moonlight through the slats. A notebook rested on her knees. Her brow furrowed as she wrote in small, tight characters. Later, that journal would be found. In it, a line would read, "They put knives in our hands and trusted us. What kind of people do that?" No one had to say it out loud, but every woman in that room felt it. The meaning of the knife had shifted. All their lives, knives had been instruments of precision, control, or violence. In war, knives meant dominance or death. In kitchens back home, what few were left, knives meant duty, survival, obedience. But here, on American soil, in a place that wore its cruelty in fences rather than fists, the knife had become something else entirely, a symbol of trust. The Americans hadn't chained their hands, hadn't stood behind them with guns raised. They'd handed them blades, pointed to the meat, and stepped back. It wasn't just work, it was a dare, a quiet challenge that said, "We believe you can do this without harm." And the women had answered. The knives hadn't turned into weapons. They'd turned into instruments of creation. Steaks had been sliced, onions diced, potatoes peeled. There had been laughter, not screams, joy, not sabotage. In a world where every choice had once been monitored, this small freedom felt explosive. Natsuko closed her journal and lay back, staring at the shadows that danced on the rafters. Tomorrow would come. There would still be barbed wire, still be roll calls and regulations. But something was different now. It had started with a knife, but it didn't end there. The next morning, the sun rose heavy and gold across the dry earth. Dust spun in warm spirals through the air. A new day. In the same place, but something felt changed. The women dressed slowly, moving through routines that were no longer quite as mechanical. And then, one of them did something unheard of. Teruko, the same girl who had laughed when the cowboy said "arigato," stood in the yard tying a ribbon in her hair. It was pale blue, frayed at the edges, pulled from the lining of an old coat. She tied it carefully, hands steady, head held high. A simple bow, neat and deliberate. Not because she wanted to be pretty, not because anyone told her to, but because she could. In a world that stripped them of softness, femininity, and pride, this small act was defiant. It wasn't a protest against America. It was a protest against erasure, against the version of themselves they'd been told to become silent, rigid, defeated. The ribbon said otherwise. One by one, the other women noticed. Some smiled, others raised eyebrows. No one mocked. In fact, someone offered a scrap of fabric. Another tried a braid. The change was quiet, almost invisible, but it was there. They were still prisoners, still far from home, but they had been given knives and hadn't turned them into weapons. They had fed their captors and been thanked. And now, with a scrap of blue tied in sun-dark hair, they were reclaiming something else. Not just survival, but self. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the edge of the Texas horizon, a guard stepped into the women's barracks with a strange question on his lips. He didn't bark it like a command. He didn't slam his boot or raise his voice. He simply asked, "Do you all think you could cook again today?" The silence that followed was unlike the silence of fear. It was the silence of disbelief, of something tender pressing against the edge of memory. The women exchanged glances. The question itself was enough to make them blink, not told, asked. By mid-morning, the fires were burning again. This time, the smoke didn't sting the same way. It rose like incense, wrapping around the women's hands as they worked. And they did work, quietly, fluidly, instinctively. There were no printed recipes, no cookbooks to follow, but somewhere deep in their bones, the memories of their mother's hands lived on. Teruko showed Yuriko how to slice the daikon thinner. "Like my aunt did," she whispered. "During the winter of '43, we only had pickles, but she made it taste like soup." Natsuko stirred miso into a pot slowly, coaxing flavor from powdered broth and scraps of seaweed sent in a Red Cross package. Her fingers moved like she was handling silk. She didn't need to speak to remember. Her hands spoke for her. It was strange how quickly cooking turned into conversation, not with words, but with movements, with spices, with heat. The cowboys leaned against the fence posts, watching with casual curiosity. One pointed to a bubbling pot and asked, "What's that?" He said it softly, so as not to interrupt. The women looked at each other. Then Taruko stepped forward, tapped the side of the pot, and said, "Nikujaga. Nikki." "What?" The man laughed. "Meat potato," she said, tapping her chest, trying to bridge the language gap. "Sweet, salty, home." He nodded slowly, the sound of it settling in. "Home," he repeated. "Smells like it." For the first time, the exchange wasn't between jailer and captive. It was between cook and guest. One by one, the Americans began to ask more. Not about war, not about politics, but about flavor, about the shapes of dumplings, the colors of soup, the way rice should feel between fingers. And the women responded, not always in full sentences, but through gestures, through laughter, through small shared nods. It was an odd reversal. The prisoners teaching the free, the conquered sharing with the victors. But somehow it made sense, because here, in the space between hunger and comfort, everyone was human again. The joy didn't come all at once. It came in flickers. A laugh held too long. A head tossed back in mock frustration when a pancake tore in the skillet. A cowboy clapping when someone flipped an omelet clean. It was fragile but real, a kind of joy that made your chest ache. By noon, the line of cowboys stretched longer than the day before. They came with plates and forks, boots coated in dust, eyes scanning the tables with anticipation. One man, a red bandana wrapped around his wrist, returned for seconds and tapped his plate with reverence. "Best thing I've had since Mama's pot roast," he said, grinning. "Y'all got any more of that, nikujaga?" The girls giggled. "Nikujaga," they corrected. He waved a hand. "Whatever it is, I'll take 3 helpings." This time, the laughter didn't feel dangerous. It felt warm, shared, like steam rising from a bowl passed between strangers who were no longer so strange. In that moment, food became something more than survival. It became offering, connection, a quiet kind of bridge that crossed language and blood. The women didn't forget where they were. The fence was still there. The uniforms still pressed. The war hadn't ended. But for a brief stretch of time, through salt and soy and beef, they were something else entirely. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and comment below where in the world you're watching from. A few days later, the news came down like a wind too gentle to believe. The Red Cross had arranged a small window of communication. 1 page, 1 envelope, 1 chance to write home. Most of the girls hadn't touched a pencil in months. Some hadn't written a sentence in years. And yet, when the guards passed around the paper, silence fell over the barracks like a held breath. Yuriko stared at the blank sheet in her lap for nearly an hour. What did you say to a mother who believed you dead? To a brother who'd seen the city fall? What words could possibly make sense of where she was now? She began slowly, her script delicate but certain. "I am alive. I am safe. I am fed." Then she paused, pencil tip hovering. A memory stirred. Smoke, steak, the fizz of a Coke bottle, and she added a line she never expected to write. "They let us cook the steaks." She blinked at the sentence, half expecting it to disappear, but it remained, steady and absurd. Real. Her hand trembled slightly as she finished the page. Across the room, Taruko hunched over her letter too, her lips moving silently as she wrote. A few girls wiped away tears, quietly folding the pages like origami secrets. They weren't sure the letters would make it through. but writing them made something shift inside, like opening a window in a long locked house. The letters traveled slowly, like whispers across an ocean. Some would never arrive, some would be read by strangers before they reached their homes, but one in particular did reach Japan and landed in the hands of a bureaucrat trained to read between the lines. They let us cook the steaks. The sentence made no sense. A prisoner of war, cooking steaks for Americans, for cowboys? It clashed with everything the Empire had taught. POWs were supposed to suffer, to resist, to vanish into silence, not write cheerful notes about food and fire pits. Censors paused, debated, then sent the letter upward, uncertain whether it was code or madness or both. Back in Texas, the women never knew if their words arrived. But writing them had done something irreversible. It gave shape to what they had no other language for. In the evenings they began to share what they wrote, reading aloud to one another in the barn, while the sun bled low behind the hills. It was there, in that dusty warmth, that Natsuko stood one evening, letter in hand, and said, "I want to read mine." The others turned toward her. She'd barely spoken since arriving. Her voice always came out in pieces, afraid of being wrong. She cleared her throat. "My dearest brother," she began, eyes flicking over the page, "I did not die. I do not know how to explain it. I am a prisoner, but they feed us. We cook. We laugh. We hear music." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "They call me by my name. They do not hit us. I do not understand it either." Her hands shook slightly as she read the last line. "They let us cook for cowboys." There was a long silence after she finished. No one clapped, no one spoke. But something reverent passed between them, a kind of quiet awe. Yuriko whispered, "You sound like yourself again." Natsuko sat slowly. "I forgot what I sounded like." Writing the letters had been about more than memory. It had been about voice, about claiming it again, about saying, "This is what happened. This is who I was. This is who I am still becoming." And in a war that had taken so much, food, home, freedom, even sound, finding the courage to speak was its own kind of victory. Weeks passed, and the ranch no longer smelled like dust alone. It smelled like garlic crushed under a knife blade, like sesame oil warming in a pan, like firewood burning down to embers long after sunset. The kitchen had become theirs not by decree, but by quiet consensus. The guards no longer hovered. They checked lists, unlocked doors, then stepped aside. The women planned the meals now. They argued softly over seasoning. They saved scraps. They learned what the cowboys liked and what they didn't, not out of obligation, but out of habit, out of pride. Work had reshaped them. Not the back-breaking labor of wartime factories or the endless scrubbing of hospital floors, but something steadier, purposeful. The kind of work that leaves your hands tired but your chest light. They rose before dawn, tied their aprons, and moved through the kitchen like a single organism. Heat, timing, balance, trust passed between them without words. If one stumbled, another filled the gap. No one shouted. No one flinched. The ranchers noticed the change before the women did. One afternoon, a cowboy lingered by the fire pit longer than usual. He listened to the clink of pans, the murmur of Japanese voices, the occasional burst of laughter. When he finally turned to leave, he set something down on the table, a harmonica, scuffed, well used. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and walked away. That night, after supper, Teruko picked it up. She turned it over in her hands, uncertain, then lifted it to her lips. The sound that came out was thin and wobbly, but real. A melody found its way through the dark, slow and tentative. Then, stronger. One of the cowboys answered from the far side of the yard with a whistle. No one laughed. The music drifted over the fence, into the fields, and disappeared into the Texas night. It felt like belonging, and that frightened them, because the closer they came to feeling at ease, the more the question crept in, quiet, persistent, dangerous. Natsuko asked it out loud one evening, sitting on the barn steps with Yuriko beside her. "When the war is over," she said, staring at the dirt, "do you think, could someone stay?" Yuriko didn't answer right away. She understood the question. It wasn't about visas or papers or laws. It was about the feeling, the safety, the dignity, the possibility of a life not built on fear. "I don't think they'll let us," Yuriko said finally. "But I think about it too." Natsuko nodded. She hadn't expected a yes. But the fact that she could even ask, that the thought had formed at all, was something new, unthinkable before. A crack in the wall she'd lived inside her whole life. The war ended quietly for them. No grand announcement, just fewer guards, more letters, whispers of ships and schedules. One by one, the women were told to prepare. Bags were packed, aprons folded, knives returned to drawers. The kitchen grew quieter. On the last morning, the cowboys gathered near the gate. Hats came off. No speeches were made. The harmonica lay on the table again, this time pressed into Teruko's hands. She bowed. They nodded back. As the truck pulled away, the women looked back at the ranch one last time. The fire pit, the tables, the place where they had been trusted, where they had cooked, where they had smelled like firewood and garlic instead of fear. They would return home changed. Not because they had been spared hardship, but because, in captivity, they had been given something rare, proof that dignity could survive war. That kindness could exist where hatred was supposed to live. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a part of history the world nearly forgot.